Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think there's still a few people floating in, but I think it will get started. And I'll start by turning it over to Trish Thomas.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Trish Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of the Landlord Self-Help Center. We are proud to be the co-organizer of this very special presentation on hoarding today. I would like to introduce Jerry Blinick, who has spearheaded this presentation. Jerry is a project manager with RentSafe and the co-organizer of today's event. Jerry has over 15 years of experience fostering broad collaboration to improve conditions that support health and well-being for all. So let's get started. Over to you, Jerry.
Thank you so much, Trish, and welcome to everyone to this webinar that aims to support landlords and housing providers to understand and respond to hoarding and rental housing. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today on this important topic. As Trish mentioned, my name is Jerry Blinick. I work with RentSafe, which is a collaborative initiative that connects people across sectors, as you will see today from our diverse set of presenters from different sectors. And we work together toward the goal of healthy housing for all. I'll begin by sharing that I am joining you from Peterborough, Ontario, or Nogojiwanong this morning, which is this afternoon. Michi-Sagig, Anishinaabe, and Chippewa territory located on Treaty 20 and within the Williams Treaties First Nations territory. The work of RentSafe takes place on Indigenous traditional territories that stretch across Ontario. We are deeply grateful to Indigenous peoples for their ongoing stewardship of these lands since time immemorial. We contextualize our work to achieve healthy housing for all within the knowledge that Indigenous people disproportionately experience issues of housing habitability, adequacy, and stability. We recognize that we are on a journey toward reconciliation and are committed to listening, learning, and working to decolonize our collaborative efforts toward the goal of healthy housing for all. I also want to begin by thanking the many people who made our presentation today possible, to our colleagues at RentSafe, and specifically many thanks to our presenters today who have offered their time and expertise out of their very busy schedules. I'd like to thank Trish and your team at the Landlord Self-Help Center for partnering to plan and deliver this workshop. And our fantastic turnout today is a testament to the strength of our partnership. And finally, a thanks to Dave Gled and his team at Ocean One Design, who created the promotional materials and has gone above and beyond to make today run smoothly. So without further ado, we'd love to hear from you, the participants, and we'd love to know where you're from and a bit about your involvement in housing. So I'm going to launch our first poll, which I welcome everyone to fill out so we can get a sense of where you're coming from today. And while you're completing this poll, I think you have to, you'll go through all of there's 4 questions. Oh, and I'm starting to see some submissions coming through. Yes, great. While you're completing these polls, I'll answer the first question that's come through the Q&A, which is, will a recording of this webinar be offered? And the answer is yes. We'll be sending out the recording as well as some follow-up materials following the webinar. Okay, and if a question doesn't apply, I'm not sure if you can skip them, but I imagine you can. Okay, so we're seeing lots of responses come in. Can one of the panelists let me know, are you seeing the results as they're streaming through, or do we end the poll? You're seeing the results? No. Okay, so I guess we have to end the poll. So I guess last call, I'll give it maybe 10 more seconds. And then when we end the poll, the results will be published. Okay, I'm hearing questions 2 and 3 are mandatory. It won't let you answer without responding. Okay, well, we'll end the poll and see and share the results. So we're seeing a lot of folks coming from Southwestern Ontario and the GTA today, a few from Central Ontario, 10 joining me, some from Northern Ontario, and then quite a few again from Eastern Ontario, and one person from another country, so welcome. The types of rental properties that we're seeing across participants, most are single detached homes, as well as almost half have multi-unit residential apartments. And 2/3 are for-profit housing providers or landlords, and almost half are nonprofit. Most are property managers. We have a number of representatives from the legal community today, landlords and housing providers, about 1/3 of participants altogether, and then we have other. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. It's nice to know who's in the room today. So I'll just share a little bit of an overview of the RentSafe Collaborative. RentSafe is an initiative of the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment, which we call KIPCHI. And as I mentioned, RentSafe works to connect people across sectors. RentSafe responds to the knowledge that housing is foundational for health and well-being. And KIPCHI is a national collaboration of organizations that work together to improve children's environmental health in Canada. So you'll see the broad array of partners who support the work of KIPCHI. RentSafe aims to break down the silos between low-income renters, landlords, and the different sectors that are involved in housing to create a system that is more supportive of tenant well-being and the right to healthy homes for all. We've previously collaborated with the Landlord Self-Help Center in 2017 when we conducted a survey both of landlords and of multiple sectors to better understand the landscape of housing and health across Ontario. So I won't go through the data that we found from the research, but I will highlight this quote from a landlord, which was that more resources and supports are needed for landlords that do care to remedy the situations. More often than not, landlords are faced with ultimatums and added pressure instead of help and support when approaching some of these agencies for help. So the work of RentSafe really aims to respond to that call to action to improve supports for everyone across the sector in that level of collaboration, and that's what we're aiming to do today. Some examples of RentSafe's previous work, we've developed a suite of resources on mold in housing, and I'll highlight specifically our expert report on mold health effects and ways to prevent and remediate mold in housing. But there's a number of different resources that we've developed, again, through that intersectoral approach of bringing together multiple actors from different sectors for different perspectives. RentSafe began our initiative on hoarding by recognizing that too often hoarding contributes to breakdown of tenancies, but is a situation that requires intersectoral response in its truest sense. We recognize that there's gaps to responding in a comprehensive or holistic way to hoarding, and that there's a need for knowledge and capacity building. So we have an ad hoc working group on hoarding with diverse representatives from multiple sectors, many of whom you'll see here today. We share knowledge, and we're in the process of developing strategic plans and key initiatives such as today's webinar to support our goals to enhance responses to hoarding across the province. And so we use a holistic understanding of hoarding with an understanding that collaboration is really at the key to supporting persons with hoarding behaviors. Okay, and so just to keep everyone up to date on what to expect for today, we're here until 2 o'clock, and we have 2 parts to our meeting, both approximately 1 hour. Part 1 will go over understanding hoarding with understanding tenants with hoarding difficulties from the perspectives of clinical and mental health. And then part 2, we will discuss different sectoral responses to hoarding through the perspectives of legal services, fire services, and public health. And there are opportunities for Q&A at the end of each part. So I'm going to launch our second poll, which is to understand a bit more about your background and understanding of hoarding. So we'll just have that up for a few minutes. Oh, I've got a fail to launch polling error. I'll try again, but we may need to just move forward. Okay, well, that one is not working. We were curious about your knowledge about hoarding, whether you've had tenants with hoarding difficulties, and how you learned, if you did have tenants with hoarding difficulties, how you learned about the hoarding. I might try and launch our second poll that's follow-up to those questions. That one worked. So if you have worked with a tenant with hoarding, what did you do? What supports were available to the tenant, and what supports were available to you? And then we're also interested in the outcome. And if you've had multiple cases of hoarding, please feel free to pick one example or generalize across your experiences. Okay, and I'll just give another few seconds and then we'll close this poll as well. Okay, thank you for everyone who participated. I'll share the results. So 71% of respondents offered help to the tenant. Quite a few contacted public health and fire services. 7% applied for an eviction order, 6% all of the above, and a quarter other. And what supports were available to the tenant? So it seems that there's a strong sense of the services that tenants accessed in response to hoarding in their housing, and that it's quite a wide array, and we're seeing a good representation in mental health and counseling. And similarly, a fair bit of response on services available to landlord or property manager, but that some did not, almost half did not seek support. And then the outcome, we see that for almost half, the problem is ongoing. For 40%, the tenant was able to maintain tenancy. Issues were largely resolved. 16% eviction, and then we have some other tenant moving out and other. Okay, well, thank you. So we're going to jump into part 1 of, oh, and we did that, of this session, and I will be playing a video from one of our RentSafe members who could not join us today. So I'll just share a new screen and we will go. And panelists, if you could give me a message in the chat that things are playing well, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hannah McCabe Bennett. I'm a clinical psychologist with a background in research, assessment, and treatment of folks with hoarding disorder. My role today is to provide information about hoarding as a mental disorder to help build a foundation of knowledge that will hopefully be helpful when interacting with tenants who have experienced issues with hoarding. An outline of what I'll be covering in my portion of the talk is understanding the difference between clutter and hoarding. I'll be reviewing the diagnostic criteria that we use to diagnose hoarding disorder, as well as talking about why hoarding happens in the first place and what keeps it going over time. So it's important at the beginning to note that extreme clutter reasons, and that it's not always safe to assume that hoarding disorder is the cause of the clutter. So for instance, someone who has severe depression might be having a lot of difficulty with energy and motivation that could make it really difficult to clean up their home. Similarly, somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD might have rituals and compulsions around needing to check every piece of garbage before it goes out. And that can take a long time to actually sort through all of your trash and all of your recycling and get it out the door. Similarly, we can see clutter as a result of things like brain injury, dementia, or other medical conditions. Sometimes a physical disability can make it really hard to remove items from home, which can then result in a lot of clutter. There's also something called Diogenes syndrome. This is a condition that affects older adults who tend to start living in squalor. So not being as motivated, not being able to notice when things like garbage and trash are building up. And that can result, of course, in a lot of clutter. And finally, hoarding disorder could be something that explains severe clutter. And we'll be getting into now what is hoarding disorder. The first thing that we tend to notice when we come across a hoarding situation is the clutter. So this is a tool called the clutter image rating, and it's commonly used to assess the severity of clutter. And the typical rule of thumb that we go by is if a space looks like a number 4 or above, that's when we might start considering hoarding disorder to be an explanation for the clutter that we see. I'm going to go through now the diagnostic criteria for how we actually diagnose hoarding disorder, and this is according to DSM-5, which is the current diagnostic and statistical manual. So this is the set of criteria that we use to diagnose all mental disorders. So the first symptom that we see in hoarding disorder is difficulty discarding. So individuals will have a lot of difficulty parting with items that they seem to have a strong sentimental or aesthetic or instrumental value. And what that means is that items that to other people might seem like they don't have much value at all might have a lot of value to the person with hoarding disorder. So there might be a strong sense of sentimental attachment. For instance, if the item belonged to a loved one who has passed away. There's also a lot of aesthetic value, so individuals will hold on to things because they just are beautiful and they bring a lot of joy to that person. We also see items that other people might see as not having value, seeming like they have a lot of instrumental value to the person with hoarding disorder. And what that means is that the person can see a lot of potential use for this item. So even if it's broken now, maybe I can fix it up and it can become really useful in the future. So when these individuals have to part with these items that hold a lot of value to them, that's really difficult emotionally. It feels like a great sense of loss. We also tend to see a strong sense of responsibility for the well-being of the specific objects, as well as for the environment. So oftentimes individuals with hoarding disorder are very concerned about contributing to landfills and pollution, and that might be one reason why they hold on to so many things. As a result of difficulty discarding, we of course see then the buildup of a lot of clutter. Typical areas that tend to become cluttered would be things like the living room, the kitchen, bedrooms, but the clutter can also extend to other areas such as your car, maybe renting a storage locker, maybe even spilling into other people's homes. Now, someone can have a diagnosis of hoarding disorder even without a lot of clutter, but that would really only be in the case of if somebody else has stepped in to intervene. So maybe a loved one has cleaned up the space for them. We tend to see also a significant impairment in terms of functioning or quality of life. So the home might get to the point of not being functional or safe, so not being able to use the kitchen or the bathroom, for instance. There might be some social impairment in terms of not being comfortable having people come over to the home, and the experience of a lot of shame and embarrassment. There are some ways that we can additionally specify the diagnosis. So some individuals will also have excessive acquisition. Actually, most people will have excessive acquisition. So this is where there's not only difficulty discarding, but also a lot of stuff coming into the house, into the home. And there can be differences in terms of the amount of insight. So ranging from good insight, so really understanding that there's a problem here and understanding what the problem is, all the way down to completely absent insight. So where they might not even notice the clutter that's there and might not understand the impact on their safety and functioning. Other important considerations for diagnosing hoarding disorder: the hoarding behavior must not be caused by another medical condition. So for instance, if the hoarding behavior is only started after a traumatic brain injury, we wouldn't consider that hoarding disorder. We would consider that a consequence of the other medical condition. Similarly, it also can't be better explained by another mental health condition. So if the clutter is only there when the person is really depressed, and when their depression is okay, there's no more clutter, we wouldn't consider that hoarding disorder. Hoarding was once considered a subtype of obsessive compulsive disorder, but in the newest edition of the DSM, it's now its own distinct diagnosis, found within the category of obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So they're within the same family, but it's now no longer considered OCD. With respect to impacts on functioning and safety, so oftentimes individuals with hoarding disorder will have a lot of difficulty completing daily tasks due to the excessive clutter. So over 90% would have restricted access to furniture like beds or couches. 80% might have restricted access to food preparation areas. There's often difficulties with accessing bathrooms, as well as difficulty maintaining home repairs. It can be uncomfortable to have people come into the home to check things out and to do the types of repairs that are necessary. There's also increased physical risk living in a home where hoarding is going on. So there's actually a shorter life expectancy by 16 years for individuals with hoarding disorder. Risks of fire, falling objects, and tripping. There might be health code violations, and it can limit access to first responders who need to go in case of emergency. With respect to development, so there's a number of different reasons why hoarding happens. There is a genetic component, so oftentimes hoarding disorder runs in families. There could also be other things that we learn from our families, not from genetics. So we might have had parents who had a hoarding problem. As young people, we might not have had control over our decisions, which then in adulthood can result in controlling how much stuff comes into the home and how much we let go. We also see that there tends to be more trauma in life histories for folks with hoarding disorder. So not necessarily that the trauma exposure causes hoarding, but we see that individuals, adults with hoarding disorder, tend to have just experienced more stressful life events throughout their life. The course of hoarding disorder, so how this affects over the lifetime. So we see a lifetime prevalence in the general population of between 2 to 5%. We understand that hoarding generally has an early onset, so starting earlier in life and even childhood and adolescence, which then worsens over time. So we can see in this figure, this is the severity of hoarding symptoms over the lifespan. So the older we get, the more severe these symptoms tend to become. And as we know, we have an aging population, and so we can expect that hoarding problems will continue to get worse over time. Comorbidity, so this is other mental health conditions that might also be present in an individual with hoarding disorder. So we understand that over 90% of individuals with this diagnosis would also meet criteria for having another mental health diagnosis. Most commonly, we would see things like depression, other impulsive acquiring disorders, so compulsive buying, kleptomania, which is stealing. We see a lot of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as well as other anxiety disorders. So things like social anxiety or generalized anxiety, so excessive day-to-day worries. These are all very common in individuals with hoarding disorder. So I'm going to now introduce the cognitive behavioral model of hoarding disorder. So this is our best understanding of what keeps hoarding problems going over time. And I'll talk about each of these in turn, starting with emotional attachment to possessions, beliefs about possessions, behavioral avoidance, and information processing deficits. In emotional attachment to possession, so this is our emotional response to the items that we keep at home. So some core elements of emotional attachment, so what makes you more likely to feel emotionally attached to an item is a sense of emotional comfort with that item. If the object has a sense of uniqueness, it seems like one of a kind, and if there's a fear of loss associated with that item. And emotional attachment can happen in all people, not just people with hoarding disorder. But we tend to see that there's stronger emotional attachment the more severe the hoarding symptoms. So a positive correlation between attachment and we also see that in this population, objects tend to be used as safety signals, meaning that we tend to think about objects as being useful for soothing intense emotions. But incidentally, individuals with hoarding disorder tend to be less effective at actually using objects for this purpose. And that could be because when we have so many objects that it's hard to find the one that's going to be the most comforting in that moment. Beliefs about possession. So these are the types of thoughts that individuals with hoarding might have about their possessions. We tend to see a lot of catastrophic predicted consequences of discarding. So you might hear things like, if I were to miss something or if I were to forget some information that's on in this newspaper, that would be terrible. If my things are violated, then I am violated. I must keep it just in case. I'm responsible for keeping my possessions safe from harm, and I would be contributing to pollution of our planet if I just threw this away. And again, we see large positive correlations with hoarding symptom severity and sense of responsibility for possessions and fear of losing control over possessions. So the more sense of responsibility I feel for my items, the more severe my hoarding is likely to be. Similarly, the more afraid I am at losing control over possessions, the more severe the symptoms tend to be. How this presents itself behaviorally is typically in a lot of avoidance. So we see something called experiential avoidance, which is basically a fancy way of saying not wanting to feel uncomfortable internal experiences. So not wanting to feel uncomfortable feelings like sadness or anxiety, not wanting to face painful memories. So the way that we avoid these internal experiences is by avoiding them in our real life. So avoiding sadness from losing a valued possession would look like difficulty discarding. If I don't want to feel sad, I just won't bother throwing it away, and then I don't have to feel that feeling. Similarly, the way this plays out with acquisition, oftentimes they might be fearful of the feeling of regret. So if I don't buy this right now, then I'm going to regret having missed out on a great opportunity, having missed out on a bargain. So instead of feeling that regret, I'll just take the item home with me. In research context, we see that when we actually bring on a sad mood, individuals with hoarding problems discard fewer items in the lab. Similarly, when we kind of have people in stressful conditions, we see that increased saving behavior. The way this also can play out at home would be having a difficult time using effective organizational systems. So oftentimes individuals would be fearful of forgetting information, which means it's important to have everything in plain sight, everything in view. So if I put things away in drawers or put things away in storage, I'm fearful I might forget about it. So that's why we tend to see a lot of clutter just kind of out and about. We also see a lot of actual perfectionism, which often takes people by surprise in the context of hoarding. We sort of think about perfectionism as that type A person who has everything perfectly organized, but really at its core, perfectionism is driven by a fear of making mistakes. And we see this all the time in hoarding, that the fear of making a wrong decision leads to not making any decisions. So for instance, what if I throw out this pamphlet that has really important information on it, and then I end up needing that later? I would be so upset with myself for making a mistake that I'm just going to hold on to everything so I don't have to fear facing that mistake. Information processing deficits. So these are specific ways that individuals with hoarding take in information from their environment, work with that information in their brain, and then make decisions based on that. So a few key areas where we see problems with information processing. One is in attention. So I mentioned earlier, individuals with hoarding disorder have higher rates of ADHD. What we understand is that really it's the inattention piece that's a unique predictor of hoarding. So the more difficulty with paying attention, the more hoarding difficulties we tend to see as well. Mostly this seems to be impairment in sustained attention, so paying attention for a long period of time, which makes sense, right? If you think about how much attention is required to sort through your mail and decide what to keep and what to get rid of, if it's hard to pay attention for a long period of time, that task is going to quickly become overwhelming and get pushed to the side. Another area that we've explored in the research is memory. So there's sort of mixed findings in the research about whether there actually are memory deficits or problems with memory. What is clear, though, is that there are deficits in memory confidence. So what this means is that individuals with hoarding problems tend to doubt their memory. And because there's that doubting of our memory, then we might hold on to things because, again, we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to throw something away that then we forget. So that can lead into that hoarding and saving behavior. Oftentimes you'll hear folks say things like, I don't want to throw out this book that belonged to my grandmother because she loved reading and I want to remember that about her. I want to be able to remember my grandmother. So there's often a fear that if I get rid of an item, I'm also getting rid of the memory associated with that item. Other information processing deficits that we've seen is in decision making, particularly in things like complex rule learning and flexibility. And if we think about creating like an organization system at home, that can be quite complex, deciding what to keep and what to get rid of. And we also need to be flexible with how we do that. When circumstances change, we might have to change the way we organize and decide what to keep and what to let go of. What we know from the research is that individuals with hoarding problems tend to be slower in how they learn new rules, also making more perseverative errors. What that means is making the same mistake over and over again, and poor conceptual functioning, so a little bit harder seeing the big picture. There's mixed findings when it comes to planning. It seems to be easier for individuals with hoarding to plan other people's discarding decisions and more difficult to plan their own decisions. We also see higher indecisiveness. So again, this is an emotion-based experience where if we're fearful of making a decision, then it's easier to just not make a decision. So indecisiveness can be something that really slows down the decision-making process, as well as difficulties generally with making categories. So in a moment, I'll go through a demonstration of the types of categorization problems that we tend to see in hoarding, which is summarized as under-inclusivity. This essentially means when you're trying to organize something, having many, many small categories versus fewer larger categories. And I'll go into the demonstration of why that can be problematic. Okay, so someone who is going through their junk drawer and trying to decide what to keep and what to let go of, if they don't have hoarding problems, they might see a pile like this and say, okay, here's a pile of buttons. Do I really need all of these buttons? So we see this as one category, the category of buttons. Now compare this to how someone with hoarding disorder might see this same exact pile. Well, instead of seeing it as one pile of buttons, they might see, okay, I've got generally this pile here, but within this, I've got a bunch of black buttons, a bunch of purple buttons, a handful of blue buttons, 2 orange buttons, some kind of gray, beige buttons, and this one really special green button, the only green button that I have. So hopefully what this demonstrates is that someone who's sorting using this under-inclusive sorting style would see this pile and see lots of unique categories, which makes the sorting process take a lot longer, right? If instead of just picking up all the buttons and throwing them away, I have to sort through each one and see which button belongs to which category. We can also see just from the visual of how overwhelming this can become. This now looks like a lot of information that I'm having to take in and make sense of. It can also contribute to that sense of uniqueness, which again is tied to emotional attachment to items. So we see this one very special green button, it's one of a kind. You know, if I need to decide how many buttons to keep, I definitely can't let this one go because I only have one. So hopefully this demonstrates how that can become quickly overwhelming for someone with a hoarding problem to try to sort and categorize everything in their home. Putting it all together, this is generally what a model of hoarding disorder would look like. So we've got certain vulnerability factors based on genetics, personal factors, personal family vulnerability factors, as well as information processing problems, so the way that our brain makes sense of information in our environment. Both of these things leading into certain types of thoughts and beliefs about objects and about what we should keep and what we should let go of. An emotional response when we're faced with discarding or acquiring. We see that then there's some positive reinforcement. So for instance, if I'm out shopping and I find something that's a great value, I'm going to take that home. Or if I'm trying to organize things and I find something in my pile that I hadn't seen in a long time, there might be some excitement about finding a lost treasure. There's also negative reinforcement happening, so the behavior continuing over time because I'm not feeling certain things, so escaping or avoiding unpleasant emotions. All of these things leading into difficulty discarding and an accumulation of clutter, essentially what we know as hoarding disorder. So hopefully this gives a bit of a background on how we understand hoarding disorder, how we diagnose it, how we understand what keeps it coming, so you have some foundation now moving forward into dealing with tenants who have hoarding problems. Thank you. Hi, I'm Dr. Hannah.
Hi, sorry, I'm just getting my feet again. Thank you, Hannah, for that wonderful overview and 101 on hoarding. I definitely learned a lot. I will now be passing it over to Sherry Hatherley. Sherry is currently a program lead for the intensive community support team with Lanark County Mental Health. Sherry has over 30 years of diverse professional experience in the field of social work with a background in criminal justice, education, dual diagnosis, hoarding treatment with proficiency in mental health and addictions. Sherry has a passion to serve the most vulnerable in our community through advocacy, education, and awareness while reducing stigma. Sherry's passion has allowed her to strategically build, grow, and advocate for multiple programs throughout the province, including court diversion programs, youth diversion, and now hoarding intervention and prevention programs. Sherry is a collaborative partner in research with St. Joe's Healthcare, the University of British Columbia, and Carleton University in regards to assessment tools, best practice, and treatment outcomes related to hoarding disorder. Sherry has 3-year training and certification with the Boston Hoarding Team and 7 years building the hoarding program, which has increased Sherry's ability to assist in promoting, training, and educating regional addiction and mental health agencies, fire departments, and external agencies to grow a coalition that serves our community comprised of 43 members. That coalition is the Ontario Provincial Hoarding Network. Thank you, Sherry, for joining us today. And I'll just get your slides up.
Thanks, Jerry. As she's grabbing the slides, I'm going to apologize now if my voice goes in and out. I've unfortunately caught that lovely cold going around. And so I may cough a little bit, but we're going to get through this, not a problem. All right, I'm actually going to get rid of me so I don't have to see me. All right, so my goal for the next 20 minutes or so is to really just bring this into a practical, all of the things that Hannah just spoke to you about the clinical elements of hoarding disorder. I now will bring it to you in a practical sense. I'm not going to give you a lot of the information around what I do from a day-to-day perspective, but take that clinical information and now round it out to how you as the audience can practice and use this in your day-to-day work. Next, Jerry. So what we're going to do is, I really want to demonstrate that whole essence of it's about language, and really the first interactions do matter. And I think specifically because you as landlords and or community members potentially could have the first connection with these individuals in the community. And certainly if you're then going to be sending them off to a different referral source or gathering more individuals in for collaborative response, then it's all about the language and your first interactions. The other element is really understanding that hoarding is not a clutter problem. It's what we see. It's a thinking problem. And I think when you start to understand and change your ability to look at things differently, it really does become a little bit easier to then use that language and practice it well. So that's my mantra to many people is hoarding is not a clutter problem, it's a thinking problem. And I think that was illustrated well through Hannah's discussion just previously. So here is what we're going to do. Go ahead, Jerry. So again, we're jumping in from the discussion from Hannah. We use a lot of that cognitive behavioral therapy. It's an informed practice. And what we do from a in-home perspective is use it in a functional form. So we're going to get into that a little bit. The integrated community support, I can't demonstrate enough how important that is for the success of your tenants and persons in your community. And one of the biggest components that we utilize in our areas is getting people ready to join our groups. And so the Buried in Treasures group itself is facilitated by me. It's got a component of that mental health and clinical piece to it, but it's derived around skill and almost taking the knowledge that Hannah just gave you and bringing it into a perspective for the client so that they really understand what's going on. I mean, often I hear from folks, I don't even know how this happened. I don't know why it happened. And so this group particularly gives them the insight in understanding that. And from that group, they then can graduate into the peer facilitated groups, which are really something that we know research-based tells us the recovery rate exponentially is so much better for them in the long term. So what doesn't work? I think this is the obvious. I start with that so that we can get into what does work, but we know now there's enough information and research that shows us that large scale cleanups without a person's permission does not work. I think if any of you have been in the business for a long time, you've probably witnessed, opportunities where, unfortunately, when we didn't know what to do successfully, we cleaned out some folks' places based on health and safety risks, and within months, it was probably back to and or worse than it was before. And with that, unfortunately, creates even more barriers for external services and persons like myself to be able to get in and support them. And so sometimes that's why it's even harder for us, and it takes a little longer for us to do that engagement piece because we're dealing with some history that they've had in their past. So even with permission, it's challenging. Again, we've had to do some cleanouts with some folks, and we now have a practice schedule that we use in terms of a lot of collaboration with the client, giving them a lot of the control that they need to move through this particular situation or event that has to happen to mitigate some risk. As well as a real coordinated plan with external services and other support systems so that it's done with as much minimal damage and or trauma that we can inflict on the client themselves. And we really work hard at not having to do that. However, there are circumstances where we have to. And additionally, medications, I get asked about that all the time. There isn't, even clients will say, just give me a med that'll help me organize and fix my brain. And unfortunately, that's just not applicable. And much like Hannah talked about, a lot of our co-occurring issues are the things that we'll address at the beginning. And once we get to know the client as we move along, we then can help support them in maybe finding some medication that will support the ADHD or maybe some of the symptoms of depression that are going to largely help us as we move forward in the work that we're going to do together. So, there we go. So some of the language, obviously, we're going to move into that. What not to do. I think it's pretty straightforward. Arguing isn't going to help with anybody. If we all have children, we know that arguing doesn't work. I can't even argue with my dog. So arguing certainly is not going to be helpful in any of these situations. Avoiding asking questions or making suggestions that push people into corners, like, why don't you just get rid of this junk? Certainly, I think can be obvious in terms of what we've heard from Hannah, why they would become a little defensive and probably push back and not respond and or avoid any connection. Some of those unhelpful questions like, don't you want to live in a nice home? Can't you smell that? I'm going to go back to the first one. Sorry. Do you want to live in a nice home? I don't even know what that is. I don't know that any of us, my nice home to your nice home is completely different. For these folks, we don't even know if they've ever had a nice home or a home that they can be proud of. So it's a question they can't even answer. And can't you smell that? A lot of my folks that I have worked with over the last 7 years, they really don't. They become very habituated to their environment. And so I might walk in and can smell what's happening in the environment, some body odors, some urine from cat or feces, or, there's a lot of different smells that we can certainly see in air smell. They don't. And often we work on those pieces as we're going through our work together so that they can start to recognize as well when things maybe are starting to fall awry and not working, but they can't smell what they're living in. Do you realize how close I am to evicting you? I can tell you they probably knew that long before you ever knocked on their door. These folks live in shame. They constantly tell me how embarrassed they are, that they're aware that they're probably a risk to people and it's not how they want to live, but they're so overwhelmed and they have no idea where to start. And what is so hard about just throwing this away? And I think you can certainly guess that just by the information that Hannah presented you with, that it really is decision making. It's that sentimentality, it's that usefulness, and that or that intrinsic feeling like, if I throw this away, I'm throwing away a memory. So questions like this only show that really you don't get it, and why should they listen? So how to get the conversation started. This is my favorite piece. And when I work with students and have them follow along with me, I always say to them, and something that I absolutely love doing when I walk into somebody's home is become curious. I like to ask non-judgmental questions, but I'm truly and genuinely curious about what is going on and how they came to be living in the environment that they are. So I will pick out an item that I see in the room and I will ask them and say, wow, that's a lot of teapots. That one looks really cool. Is there a story behind that one? Or ask them about a piece of furniture that really looks old and antique-ish, or talk about the stack of newspaper and say, wow, there must be a lot of information you like to gather from those newspapers. What's your special, newspaper that you like to get? Again, curiosity. So you're not judging them and you're truly not asking the question about, well, let's just get rid of stuff because you have too much stuff in here. You genuinely care about what's going on around them. And I can tell you that 99% of the time, I have easily been able to open the door with someone and start a conversation just by that curiosity. So you're asking, you're not telling them. What do you think your neighbor has a problem with your yard, rather than your yard is full of garbage and we've received complaints about pests, right? So ask them, because one of the other beautiful pieces about language is if you're the first person to have a conversation with them and you're asking them a question, you're going to get information that is going to feed the people that are now going to come in and help them. So the more information about their story and what's been going on that you can provide certainly is another step forward for these folks in the work that we're going to do. So actively listening and reflecting back. So helping them understand that, you've said that there is no problem in your home and that you're getting complaints from your neighbors. Tell me what that means to you. Again, you're getting more information that certainly is going to be able to be passed forward. So as Hannah mentioned, there are so many elements to hoarding disorder. And so what we do when we walk into these situations in home is we really try to build strategies with them in a very natural environment. So dealing with hoarding is challenging, and we have lots of different skills that we try to master and the best outcomes possible and maintain healthy relationships. So I'm going to very briefly, because you could seriously do another day presentation just on these 4 categories, but I'm going to give you some snippets of information that are really going to help you move forward with clients around mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, some distress tolerance techniques more for us, and emotion regulation. So mindfulness, I think we all would know. So mindfulness means as you're coming into an environment, I'm going to create a practical sense to these for you. Is being present and purposeful in that moment, that non-judgmental. And so when you're walking into a home and maybe you're aware that there's going to be a lot of things, a lot of stimulation around you, there might be a lot of smell, lots of sound, is to be present and in that moment and just walk in and notice your reaction so that you can be mindful of that. And because body language, I can tell you in the many years that I've been doing this, these folks will recognize body language before anything else, and it may shut down the conversation before it even starts. And so being mindful of how you are when you walk into that environment or that, the apartment or the unit is helpful so that you can stay focused on your plan and what you're planning on doing in that moment with that client. Interpersonal effectiveness. So we don't want, I don't expect you to remember the dear man. This is just sort of the acronyms that we use to remember some of the things that we want to, instill in ourselves as we're working with these folks, but how to effectively ask for something or say no to unreasonable requests without saying no. So basically you're inviting, you're describing the situation, you're expressing how you feel, asking for what you need while asserting yourself and reinforcing ahead of time why. And then the man really is for us to stay mindful and appear confident and negotiate if needed. And so the next slide is going to give us a little example that we're going to walk through. So using this strategy, and I hope everybody can see it well enough, it's pretty big, but so the D is, I noticed that there are a few newspapers on your stove. I feel nervous when I see that. So this is the conversation you're having with this tenant. I really want your home to be safe as possible so that your neighbors don't get hurt. Keeping your newspapers there is a fire hazard, so I need you to clear them from the stove by the next time I come. So giving them something specific that they can work on. I know how hard it can be to find space for everything or to throw things away. I really appreciate you making an effort to move them away from the stove. I bet you would probably feel happier if I didn't have to come knocking on your door. And this is one of the common threads that we use all the time with our fire and landlords, and even some of the other professionals that have to come into the home that are the stick, right? They hold that parameter of bylaw and regulation and things that we can't control. We can't change that stuff. Those are things that we have to abide by. And so we use some of those pieces, like, I bet you'd really kind of not like me to come back again. And so here's how we can do that. So then again, it's that staying focused, ignoring distractions, appearing confident and not controlling. And if it's too hard to recycle the newspapers this week, can you help me find another place for them that is less dangerous? Recognizing some of the things that Hannah has just described, they might not be ready to relinquish anything. They might not be ready to discard anything. However, understand that there's risks. So by you offering to find alternatives to support the movement forward is certainly going to be advantageous for you in that relationship. Again, some of the really important features is tone really does matter. Be gentle, act interested, validate that kernel of truth that you find, and have an easy manner about you will move you far along into this relationship and outcomes that you would like to have happen. So let's get into validation. This is like my biggest, even though what it isn't is cheerleading, it's my biggest cheerleading for me. And it's the area that I look for the most when I want to help people move forward. And validation really is part of the key to helping people motivate. So agreeing with, giving up, or giving in and cheerleading isn't what we want you to do. It's finding those little kernels of truth, acknowledging that the other person's opinions and feelings, whether you understand them or agree with them, but validating those are certainly valuable in the movement forward. Oh, sorry. And stating that the why is understandable, even if the what isn't, and only validate what is being validated. And by all means, please, as best as you can, be genuine. If you can't be genuine, it's better to keep it short and simple, and just have others invited in that maybe are able to do some of this work with them. And that is perfectly fine, because being genuine is key as well. So invalidation, I think this is going to be pretty obvious. So, why do you still have that stuff over here? You knew I was coming back today. And I'm using the tone that they're going to hear. Don't you realize how dangerous it is to have all this junk piled up here? Don't you care about your home? It's obvious that things aren't going to change here anytime soon, et cetera, et cetera. I'm pretty sure that's not going to elicit anyone wanting to help regardless. So they wouldn't feel motivated to comply. The power of validation, really, we see it often when we use it, is I can see that you have had some trouble clearing away this area like we talked about the last time. You must have felt a bit nervous knowing I was coming over today. And is there something about these items in particular that make it difficult to part with? So acknowledging some of that, the understanding of what hoarding disorder is coming through in that statement alone, because they at times don't even understand what's going on or why they make the decisions that they are making. And so by inviting that through a conversation really helps move it forward, and it motivates people to want to continue to understand what's happening. And we use this constantly in an active form as we visit all of the time, day to day. And this will promote the person to be more willing to work with you and or other people that you might invite into their environment. So distress tolerance is one of my faves. It's more for myself and I'll give you a little example. Some of the students I bring in, and I will address this before they go in, because folks that haven't been exposed to a lot of hoarding, it is a different element to work in. And one of my staff, it was funny because he immediately said, you just have to be able to have the ick factor shouldn't matter. And he's right. He was absolutely right. But folks that haven't been exposed to some of this before, it's really hard to manage when you're not getting the response that you're hoping for or the movement that you're expecting or wanting. It's hard internally to manage some of that. And so we use a lot of these skills to help us keep your cool when things are getting a little heated. So again, you're not going to disengage that relationship. So we use paced breathing, make meaning of the situation, and self-soothe. And it's funny, I actually wore, just to give an example. So I use self-soothing a lot, not because I am not able to manage some of the distress that might be happening in the environment that I'm working in, but more to keep me present. The breathing part is relatively easy for me. I can take a breath or turn away and take a deep breath and be fine. Looking for something to learn from the situation. Again, I like to ground myself by reminding myself that these folks are embarrassed and they already feel ashamed. And so I'm here to help them relinquish some of that and get to know what that means and move them forward. So that helps me ground myself in that moment. But the self-soothing is one of my favorites because, I was right off the bat, I used to put some mentholatum underneath my nose just to help with the smell piece so that my body didn't show my response to the smell in the environment. But it became evident that just having like a little bit of essential oil on me reminded me to stay present. And so it kept me focused because I could smell that. And that was just my own cognitive way of being present. So these really can help us in a lot of different situations and really do help us in the moments when we're working with folks. So how can community response help you? In essence, we're going to come in and we're going to assist. We're going to assess the client. We're going to use lots of tools that we use from that clinical perspective to identify what the story and the journey is for this particular client, and then what steps to help manage them for second and third and what we need to do. We become part of that collaborative situation and a partner. We aren't the sole partner. So mental health should never just be the only person walking in the door. This is a collaborative process, right from landlords to fire to mental health to maybe addictions to other specialized services, depending on what the information we've collected identifies. We're navigating extra services for folks because it's not just the short term. We're here to provide an insurance that the long-term recovery of this client, because obviously there's lots of things in the background that people don't know. That's why there's clutter, and we're identifying those and navigating services to help the tenant now and to move forward. We will provide that one-on-one in the home. We do the treatment. So we do that hoarding treatment that's based on that CBT formula. And so we look at all of those components that Hannah spoke about, identify them, and then help the client through that process of understanding as well as through that decluttering process. The ultimate piece that we always look for in our program is to get to ensure the client is aware of the groups, and that it's really important to get them to a group where they're going to gain those skills that are obviously going to give them, that step up in the future of their recovery, so that if things start to fall back, they can remember, I have my book, I have these things that are happening, as well as that peer support element that's going to keep them engaged should they need it. What are the challenges currently that we're facing? I think it's pretty easy to understand that funding is an issue. From a mental health perspective, it has not been identified yet as something within the criteria. We in our agency put it under case management, but because of the complexities, there's additional funds that are needed to help support even those intervention pieces. So we do intervention and prevention, and much like Hannah spoke about, anything above a 4 really does tell us that there is a hoarding issue of some sort. And so for us, on that clutter image rating, from 4 to 6 is our prevention mode. We could go in there and give some skills and really get people, the threshold maintained or down. If it's intervention, it's 7 to 9, which that's where those costs come into play. Dumpsters, biohazard material that needs to be removed, enviro cleans, persons to come and move things out of the house, and garbage disposal, and an entourage of other things that can happen. That costs money. And so agencies don't typically have that. We resort to housing departments, social housing or housing municipality. We've looked at fire departments. We've had to be really creative in our community about how to afford some of the things we've needed to assist people in intervention. There's always ongoing education and training, ensuring people know about the assessment tools that we use and how to go about using them. Managing the complex needs requires patience. And so often with landlords, I will have to work very closely with them and just engage the complex needs comment or conversation around patience is required for those positive outcomes. And often we're looking at it from a case management. There's a lot of other things they haven't had. Doctors, their finances have not been looked at. There's a lot of physical health issues. They haven't had a doctor. They need medication. There's a lot of other moving parts versus just the clutter. So we typically look at minimum threshold in safety and move right into the other piece and triage those. So that's why it takes a little longer. Managing wait lists in different agencies, because again, there isn't any specific funding. So they're working within the capacity that they have. And often depending on the complex needs and how long it takes for some folks to go through the process of treatment and case management. So again, that successful outcomes happen with partnerships. However, not just a mental health solution. And sometimes, I often will say that I feel like an event planner because I'm going to find so many different people to be part of the process to help this individual. And that collaboration and understanding of the disorder is really imperative. And by being here today and just hearing Hannah's chat and wanting to learn more about hoarding really is the step up to supporting your tenants.
Sherry, I know we're approaching the end of your slides. I just we want to have time for some questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
So again, this is pretty much the end of it. So putting it all together is much like what Hannah described, is all of those things we chatted about around mindfulness and describing situations, having that conversation. It's not telling, it's asking, reinforcing that, staying mindful, appear confident, being gentle, act interested, validate, and those are things that are going to be successful in your interactions. And this is the last one anyhow. So hoarding is a complex mental health disorder, much easier to get buy-in from tenants who hoard if you show the interest and understand their difficulty. Slow down and use effective communication. Prepare the script ahead of time. We've done that many times, and keep your cool. That's
Thank
it.
you. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much for sharing these tips and your knowledge and expertise with us today. I think there's a lot of helpful tools that you've shared. We do have a few questions for you, and then we have a number of questions that we'll save for our broader panel. So a question from Rhody Lynn. I'm in Northern Ontario. I'm not aware of any cleaning, mental health, or counseling services available to tenants. I've tried to call GAPS, personal and professional support, and social services, but neither of these places offered physical assistance to tenants who needed help to prep for bed bug treatment, etc. I would appreciate any resources on who can physically help tenants in these hoarding instances. Thanks.
That is a fantastic question, and it's one that doesn't have a great answer. And I think that that's some of the challenges that we're facing across the province. And it's not just is the understanding of the complex needs and the dollars that are involved in supporting some of these folks. Again, you know, I don't know how far, where in Northern Ontario you are. I come from the Timiskaming Shores area, and I know that the CMHA there. And so reaching out to some of those mental health agencies, and inviting them, if they haven't already, to maybe access some opportunities. And I certainly can provide some of those websites and colleagues that can offer that support and services, and hopefully entice them to learn and grow their services in Northern Ontario.
Thanks, Sherry. One last question we'll do for this panel, and then we'll turn it over to our other sectors for their perspectives. Lorna has shared that in their experience, most hoarders don't think they have a problem and don't feel that it's necessary to get help for hoarding.
Mm-hmm. And that is a common thing as well. And that's why I use the terminology health and safety. So when I'm invited to go into somebody's home, I start to use language of, you know, the health and safety part of it. And if there's been a fire or a landlord that has invited me into that environment, it's mitigating their risk. And as we're growing and building rapport, and they become more aware of what this is, often their mind changes a little bit and they're a little bit more open to having that support. But I don't go in there with the hoarding language. I walk in as a health and safety and worried about their home and maintaining their home and not being evicted or depending on what's brought them in.
Thank you. And Rhody Lynn is in Thunder Bay, and Gina has said that there is a CMHA in the area. Sherry, I don't know if you work directly with that CMHA.
I have knowledge of that CMHA, yes. So she is more than welcome if she has a contact, and I certainly don't mind setting up some information and supports for them.
Okay, I'll be sharing my email address at the end of this presentation, so I can help facilitate that. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, Sherry, again, and to Hannah as well. Okay, so we're moving on to part 2, which will provide insight on working with tenants with difficulties from the perspectives of legal, fire services, and public health. So I will now gladly introduce Wade Poziomka, who is a partner at Ross and McBride LLP, practicing in the area of human rights law. Wade has acted for tenants and landlords with respect to human rights issues arising in accommodation. Wade obtained his degrees from the University of Toronto and Cornell University. He is the former chair of the Ontario Bar Association's Constitutional Civil Liberties and Human Rights Section Executive, and was one of 3 applicant side appointees to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario's Practice Advisory Committee. Wade has been recognized by Best Lawyers Canada and is Lexpert ranked. So thank you very much for joining us, Wade, and also thanks to Sharon and Angela, who Wade will also introduce.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. I want to start by introducing my co-panelists. Angela Jensen is a staff lawyer at the Grey Bruce Community Legal Clinic, and she primarily works in housing law. Sharon Crow is the Director of Legal Services for the Community Legal Clinic of York Region. Both are very knowledgeable, know far more than I do about the Residential Tenancies Act, and have been an absolute pleasure to work with in preparing for today. I know we're short on time, so let's jump right into the presentation. If we could turn to the next slide, please.
Sorry, I've just lost this.
There we go. Perfect. So as most of you know, the Residential Tenancies Act imposes a duty on a tenant to keep their home in a reasonably clean condition. Landlords have the duty to meet housing and health standards in their premises. If a landlord suspects a health and safety issue in a unit, they can serve the tenant with a 24-hour notice of entry. The RTA does not specifically address the issue of accumulation of clutter or the removal of clutter. The Ontario Human Rights Code recognizes hoarding as a disability. And when it does that, and it negatively impacts on one of the rights and obligations in the Residential Tenancies Act, it opens the door to the Ontario Human Rights Code, the duty to accommodate, and a number of other important principles that we'll cover this afternoon. It's well established that the Landlord and Tenant Board must consider human rights principles in its decision. Section 64(1) of the Residential Tenancies Act covers reasonable enjoyment. Section 66(1) relates to the safety of a person. So tenants are responsible for the ordinary cleanliness of the rental unit. They're liable for undue damage from willful and negligent conduct, and they're liable if their conduct amounts to a serious impairment of safety. And an example of this would be a fire hazard or something that substantially interferes with another tenant's reasonable enjoyment of their property. There's other considerations other than the Residential Tenancies Act that are going to be spoken to next, but I'll just cover them briefly. The Fire Protection Act, this deals with the storage of combustible material, maximum loads, and pathways of egress in a rental unit. And in the city of Hamilton, and in most other cities, there's property standards bylaws that cover things that result in pests, interference with pest control, treatment, or blockages to the means of egress. Let's turn to the Human Rights Code next. That's the definition of what a disability is under the Human Rights Code. It's quite broad. And in my view, when I'm speaking about human rights generally, I'll tell people that it's normally something that's in excess of a common cold. Anything that a WSIB claim could be filed for in a workplace would be covered under the definition of disability, for example. The Human Rights Code applies to housing, so rental housing being accommodation is one of the social areas that human rights protects. We also know that hoarding disorder is now covered in the DSM-5, which has already been established. And there's some studies that suggest that 2 to 5% of individuals have hoarding disorder. So the point to drive home here is that there is no question that hoarding disorder is a disability. Let's turn now to methods of discrimination or types of discrimination. In the housing context, direct discrimination would be a situation where a tenant applies to rent a unit. The landlord's aware that they have hoarding disorder and says, I'm not going to rent you because you have hoarding disorder. So I'm not going to rent you because of your disability. That's direct discrimination. Most discrimination with respect to hoarding disorder will come about from adverse effect or constructive discrimination. It's the most common type of discrimination in the Human Rights Code. And it's when you have a neutral policy or requirement that applies to everybody, but it affects somebody differently because of a code protected ground. I'll give you a quick example of that. I had a case where I acted for an individual who worked in a call center. There was an obligation in that call center that everybody working on the floor had to make 800 minutes of calls every month. If you didn't make 800 minutes of calls in a month, you were fired. It doesn't matter the reason. They don't ask questions. You're gone. My client didn't make 800 minutes of calls. They were really close to it, but they were also absent for 2 days for cancer treatment. And so while they have this policy that applies equally to everybody, it affected my client differently because he had cancer, which is a disability under the code. And that would be an example of where this neutral policy impacts somebody differently on the basis of disability. And again, the most common type of discrimination that we see in human rights. Go to the next slide. So this is the definition under the DSM-5 for hoarding disorder. This has already been covered in the previous presentation, and we need to make up some time so we can move on to the next slide. Here's some key principles that come from landlord and tenant board cases or human rights tribunal cases. So in hoarding cases, in one decision, they said the heart of the dispute is whether or not eviction is reasonably necessary in all the circumstances. To reach this conclusion, the landlord must establish that accommodating the tenant's disability would mean undue hardship for the landlord. In tenants who are at risk of eviction, if there's so much clutter that it creates a fire hazard, causes offensive odors, attracts pests, or makes pest control difficult, or obstructs the landlord's ability to maintain the premises. This is really important. So when you look at this and you're looking at eviction for someone who has hoarding or who's been diagnosed with hoarding disorder, the duty to accommodate exists, which is quite extensive and requires a lot, and we'll cover that in a moment. But it does end at a reasonable point, and that's undue hardship. So hoarding disorder can have many different impacts. It can reach a level where tenants no longer have access to several areas of their home. It can lead to health and safety hazards, fire hazards, mold, bug infestations, and making bug infestations extremely difficult to treat and rectify. There can be rodent issues. And something that you don't typically think about, but that's important from a human rights perspective, is that hoarding disorder from one tenant can exacerbate another tenant's disability, a neighboring tenant in a different unit, for example, and it can create complex situations of competing human rights, most difficult types of human rights cases to deal with for landlords. So steps to take if hoarding is suspected. There is a duty to inquire. So there was a recent decision, and I think we can post some of these decision citations into the chat, which I will send to our moderator shortly. But a recent decision where a landlord had inspected a unit and saw clutter in the unit in the past, and they initiated eviction proceedings, and the board found that they ought to have known about it regardless of whether the tenant specifically told them or not. So if you've gone into a unit, you see signs of hoarding, but it might not be at the level where it's extremely evident, you still have a duty to ask questions and inquire. And in this case, the tenant testified that the accumulation of clutter did not relate to the condition or to hoarding disability. And the board found that because that was a position that the tenant took, she would not change her behavior, and found that there was undue hardship on the basis of health and safety and maintain that eviction in that case. But that's not always the case. And sometimes tenants won't recognize that they have hoarding disorder, or they're not at a stage to recognize that, but you may recognize that. You still have a duty to inquire. And in those situations, what I would recommend you do from a legal perspective is send a letter to the tenant's physician through the tenant, asking certain questions about whether a disability is at play, not what the disability is, but whether accommodations are necessary, what the functional limitations are. And that's a way that you can protect yourself if you have a situation where a tenant's saying, no, I don't have hoarding disorder, but there's no pathways of egress in the unit, and there's health and safety issues that are growing and arising. We can skip over this slide. So we've already seen the clutter image rating scale. So with respect to the duty to accommodate, there's two components to it. There's a procedural obligation. So this is your brainstorming session. So once you're aware that there's a disability, or that you reasonably ought to be aware that there's a disability, you have the obligation to educate yourself about that disability and the disability related needs. So you brainstorm all of the ways that you could possibly assist the tenant as a landlord. And that's the first component. So you sit down, you brainstorm. And then the second component is your substantive obligation, which means that you actually offer the accommodation to the point of undue hardship. And here's some ways that you can do that. So you create a plan with the tenant. You recognize that it's a process. It could take time. You, in some situations, have to pay for it. And that's something that a lot of landlords are surprised at, that you might have to cover the cost of decluttering a tenant's unit who has hoarding disorder. And again, I'll give you the citation for a case, but there was a case where a tenant sought relief from eviction, and a legal clinic became involved kind of at the very end of the repeated failures to declutter the unit. Also, the Children's Aid Society became involved and assigned a worker to the tenant. The medical information in this case was lacking. It was from 2011. The case happened in 2018, so it was about 7 years old. And the tenant requested relief from eviction and also asked the landlord to pay the costs for preparing the unit for treatment. Landlord challenged the medical information. The board did express some concern with the medical information that was presented. So there is an expectation that medical information when you're getting into hoarding disorder and accommodation needs will be recent, but also found that in these circumstances, for a number of reasons that we don't have time to get into, that they would grant relief from eviction and they would order the landlord to cover the cost of decluttering. And the board stated, though, in doing that, the tenant ought not to consider the extensive clemency extended to her throughout the history of these files as a license to continue her course of misconduct. She's at serious risk of termination should she continue to be in breach. So again, there were steps that happened in that file that led to the conclusion that we might be able to get the clutter under control. It wasn't the end of the road. And so the board said not evicted and pay for that decluttering. You also want to allow tenants to accumulate. You don't want to, but you have an obligation when there's hoarding disorder not to say that their units have to be perfect. They can accumulate more clutter than other tenants, but it can't get to the point where it's a health and safety issue without taking steps. So don't think that the standard that you're going to impose is one of perfection. Early intervention is important where possible, extending deadlines for compliance, offering assistance with decluttering. It doesn't necessarily have to be you pay an outside agency. Establish a list of contacts and supports that the tenant can call or that you can call on behalf of the tenant, and work with outside professionals. If you're a landlord or a building that doesn't have funds, it's in a deficit, and it just doesn't have the money to cover the cost of decluttering and assisting the tenant, then that would likely be found to be undue hardship. There was one where a building provider had paid $2,000 already, and they were already in a deficit, and the board found that in that situation, because they didn't have excess funds, it would be an undue hardship on the basis of cost to require them to pay for it. So they won't have to pay for it in every case, but large building providers will likely have to do that. So undue hardship, in my view, is these are the only considerations you consider for undue hardship. It's not what do other tenants feel, are they annoyed? If there's competing human rights, that's different, but you can look at cost. Cost can't be this cost $2,000, we're not doing it. It has to be this cost $2,000, we don't have the money to do it. And you're gonna wanna show that in a quantifiable way. You're gonna wanna show your budget, your financial situation, and it has to be something that's extreme. It can't just be it costs money, not doing it. Health and safety is obviously very important, especially when you get to fire codes and things of that nature. But when you hit a certain threshold and you've achieved undue hardship, the duty to accommodate comes to an end. We can skip over the case study. We do have some quiz questions that we'll cover we'll cover some of those principles. So the last thing I wanted to touch upon here is a recent decision. So this was a cooperative. They had 250 members and a volunteer board of directors. The member was a single mother collecting ODSP and caring for her disabled adult son. Hoarding became a problem in 2010 and it worsened in 2013 to the point that stuff was piled from floor to ceiling. And on that clutter image rating scale that you've seen a couple times now, the ratings were between a 6 and 9. So in April of 2013, the board issued a notice to appear, spoke to the member, expressed its concern. It decided to evict, but it suspended that decision if the member would sign a performance agreement. Member refused to sign that, but there was some legal intervention and medical information provided, and ultimately decluttering services were arranged. It got worse again. There was no clear pathway from room to room. There was a cockroach infestation and they were unable to treat it. Fire department eventually came in, issued 2 orders to comply, and then found a violation. In this case, the cooperative also spent $2,000 to assist with moving some of the items in the unit into storage. And this was a situation where the board issued a 17-page decision, but said, given the history and severity of the member's hoarding disorder, it may well be that the increase in services now available to her will still be insufficient to address her needs. That being said, I agree with the basic principle. If the Toronto Fire Service is satisfied the unit is no longer a safety hazard, then it would not be unfair to refuse eviction. And so what the board did here was said, I'm going to leave this decision in the hands of the Toronto Fire Service. So we're going to require the co-op to let the Toronto Fire Service re-inspect the unit. If the fire service says it's no longer a safety hazard, eviction's refused. If they say it's still a safety hazard and the inspection order is there, then the eviction will proceed no earlier than 30 days from that date of reinspection. So put it back in the hands of health and safety for one last chance for that tenant in this case. So some takeaways: approach the situation in good faith. We saw at the outset with the quiz and the poll that was posted that 40% of situations resolve themselves with proper intervention. Gather information under your procedural component for the duty to accommodate. And then once you have that information, offer the best accommodation short of undue hardship, your substantive component. Don't overreact if it's relatively early in the process. It is a process. It takes time. It's connected to anxiety and all the things we've seen in the earlier presentation. So don't have an immediate expectation that it will resolve itself right away. And then be prepared. So if ultimately it doesn't resolve itself and you're one of those situations where you do have to take steps for eviction, document your attempts to accommodate, be clear about what the undue hardship factors are, show that you've considered it as a board, and be prepared to present things that aren't speculative. You can be successful in an eviction proceedings, but the accommodations and the attempts to work with the tenant are not always a waste of time, and they're an essential ingredient to being able to evict when somebody has hoarding disorder. And again, I'm speaking as if that's the goal. It's certainly not the goal. It's to resolve the situation and allow the tenant to be accommodated and remain in housing. And I think we can probably skip over the last two slides and move to Angela and Sharon.
Thank you, Wade. So Angela and I work for community legal clinics, and community legal clinics are located across Ontario and provide free legal advice and representation to tenants who are low income or on social assistance in several different areas of law, including landlord and tenant. Community legal clinics often represent tenants who are facing eviction due to hoarding concerns. And when a tenant comes to a legal clinic for assistance, we consider things like whether the state of the unit meets the threshold for hoarding, the history and reasons behind the hoarding, and what, if anything, the landlord has done to work with the tenant to address the issue. There is also obviously a practical component to our advice in hoarding issues, and that being whether the tenant is able to reduce the clutter in the unit. More often than not, we conclude that there is a disability related to both the state of the unit and the tenant's ability to do something about it, and that triggers the landlord's duty to accommodate. So at that point, we often advise the landlord of their duty to accommodate and ask the landlord to work with us to come up with a solution. And we also advise the tenant of their need to cooperate in this process. In the best case scenarios, landlords acknowledge their duty and work with the tenant, the legal clinic, and outside agencies to come up with a plan. And in the worst case scenarios, landlords deny that they have a duty to accommodate, and we have to argue the matter at the Landlord and Tenant Board and sometimes the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. At that point, as Wade explained, the landlord will need to establish that they have attempted to accommodate the tenant's disability to the point of undue hardship. Simply put, failing to accommodate can be stressful, frustrating, costly, and time-consuming for everyone involved. I'd like to encourage landlords to consider community legal clinics as a potential ally when responding to a hoarding concern. Even before an eviction notice is served, we can speak to the tenant about your concerns, advise them on the risks of inaction, and connect the landlord and tenant with supports in the hopes of coming up with a plan. On the other hand, when we first encounter a tenant who has already been served with an eviction notice, they are often in a state of crisis. They are extremely anxious about the possibility of losing their belongings and their home, and oftentimes there is not a lot of time before the actual hearing to work with them. So our ability to reach creative, efficient, and out-of-court solutions is limited. I'll leave you with one short case study to demonstrate how working collaboratively with a tenant can be successful for both parties. In this case, the tenant had lived in the unit for over 20 years, and over time, clutter had accumulated to the point where large portions of the unit were inaccessible. The fire department had issued an order to comply, The tenant had both mental and physical disabilities, which prevented her from both being able to do the required work and having the insight to understand why the work was necessary. The landlord did not attempt to accommodate her and instead started the eviction proceedings. We then advised the landlord that they had not met their duty to accommodate and would not succeed with their application. The landlord ended up retaining their own lawyer, who confirmed that they had to accommodate the tenant. The parties then worked with the tenant's family health team and a mutually agreed upon cleaning service. The landlord agreed to extend the timelines for compliance and was flexible regarding minor setbacks. The unit was decluttered over the course of a few months and the tenancy was preserved. I'll pass it on to Angela, who has another case study.
Yes, I'll just tell you briefly about a situation in which I was involved that also had a successful outcome in resolving a hoarding matter. In this situation, the landlord received complaints from other tenants that there was an unpleasant smell emanating from a tenant's apartment. The landlord did an inspection and discovered that the apartment was piled full of garbage bags. The landlord started by issuing a couple of letters to the tenant expressing concern about the situation. Unfortunately, the situation did not change. And when the landlord did a subsequent inspection a couple of months later, actually found the situation had become worse. There were more garbage bags, and also of concern, there were several teddy bears in the oven, and there was concern that perhaps there would be a fire risk if the oven would be turned on when it was full of stuffed teddy bears. So at that point, there were some other things happening with the tenant, and the individual ended up hospitalized. The landlord issued an N7 eviction notice under the Residential Tenancies Act and also applied to the Landlord and Tenant Board to evict the tenant. It was at that point that the landlord called the legal clinic and said, this tenant has mental health issues. I'm sure we really want to preserve this tenancy. This individual needs some help to navigate the situation. So we can't, as lawyers, just call people up and say someone called us and said you need help. We actually need individuals to reach out to us. That's just how our profession works, that we operate on instructions from our clients. So the arrangement I made with the landlord was that the landlord was going to pass on our contact information to the person's mental health worker with whom that individual was connected through the hospitalization. And if the mental health worker could help the tenant call us, then we could get involved to assist. So we ended up having a connection with the tenant through the mental health worker, and the mental health worker and I and the tenant and the landlord ended up coming up with a mediated agreement to resolve the situation. So the tenant preserved the housing, and the mediated agreement did accommodate the tenant in a number of ways. It allowed the tenant a year to get the apartment back into a state of ordinary cleanliness. It recognized that there must be progress in the ordinary course of events with reaching ordinary cleanliness. But if something unusual were to happen in the person's life that delayed the process, then allowances would be made for that. One other candid conversation that we had through these discussions in creating the agreement were that the landlord couldn't actually impose on the tenant that the person take mental health treatment. The landlord truly cared for this tenant, understood that mental health was the heart of the problem, and wanted to put into the agreement that the tenant would take medications and would stay connected with mental health supports. So we had candid conversations that landlords can't actually tell people what to do with their own bodies or what supports to access, but they can focus on addressing the behaviors that are arising from the mental health conditions in a mediation agreement. And then it's my role as that tenant's lawyer to explain to the tenant that the individual can choose to live however they want, can choose to take treatment or not treatment, They just have to understand that depending on the choices they make, their housing may be in jeopardy. So that in my mind is a good example of how engaging legal clinics in these hoarding situations with tenants can be helpful to landlords, because we do have a role, as Sharon said, in encouraging tenants to cooperate in these situations, understand the legal risks they're taking if they don't address the mental health challenges or other challenges that are underlying the hoarding in order to preserve their housing. So I'm going to hand things back to Wade, who has a quiz for us.
Let me just ask our moderator, do you want to go into the quiz questions, or do you want us to respond to questions posed to us from the audience members? Just being mindful of time.
Yeah, how about we do one or two of the quiz questions, and we'll get to the questions after we hear from our fire services and public health presenters. Is that okay?
Sure, sounds good.
Is there a question you prefer?
Let's take a quick peek here. I think question 4 might be a good one to cover. So everybody can take a chance to read that and respond, and then we can have a brief discussion.
Okay, so it looks like most people answered A, which is the correct answer. In human rights law, as Wade mentioned earlier, the intent to discriminate or not discriminate is irrelevant for consideration. And where there's evidence or reasonable grounds to believe that a disability might be tied to behavior, a landlord does have a duty to inquire. Wade, do you want to pick the next question?
Yeah, maybe we could just do one more, and maybe we could do question 6. So 96% of you would say that this violates a code, and 4% would say it doesn't. The correct answer is it does. In Ontario, the law is not the same everywhere across Canada, including federally, but in Ontario, from a human rights perspective, those two components of the duty to accommodate, the procedural component, which is the brainstorming component, figuring out how you can accommodate someone, is separate from then what do you do once you've done that brainstorming. So that's your substantive component. If you fail to do the first, even if you get the second right, it's discrimination, and the tribunal will order damages. And part of the rationale for that is, well, if you don't do the first, how do you know for sure that you got it right in the second category? If you're not doing the brainstorming, we don't know what all of the options are. We can do that after the fact, but there's a good policy incentive to brainstorm and get it right in the beginning, so people don't have to go to the Human Rights Tribunal, wait 2 years to get a judgment for something that could have been done correctly in the first place. So that is the correct answer.
Well, thank you very much to Wade, Angela, and Sharon for this thorough presentation. Maybe just one quick question that I think should be pretty easy to answer is the question of the legal citations and sharing those. Yeah,
so if I post those into our panelist chat, can that be posted to the participants?
Yes, and maybe I should be able to get a copy of the chat, but if not, I'll also ask for it by email.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. And thank you for that thorough overview. There's certainly a lot of questions that have come forward. So I'll look forward to our panel discussion. But without further ado, I will now turn it over to Shannon Godward. Shannon is the Public Education Officer with Richmond Hill Fire and Emergency Services and the President of the Ontario Association of Fire Educators. She has been with the fire service for 14 years, spending the last 11 in fire and life safety education. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. I'm going to apologize right off the bat. I've been hit with this cold that's going around, so I'll try and make it through without coughing or sneezing or losing my voice too many times. So on the screen, Jerry, I'll just get you to flip through a couple of pictures that are there on that first slide. So the 200 Wellesley Street fire is probably one of the most familiar and unfortunate fire incidents related to hoarding. The fire marshal's report pegs the damage of this fire at over $1 million, not considering indirect costs. So not all hoarding situations obviously end this way, and we've already heard some other examples from the other panelists of successful intervention of fire services in hoarding situations. Next slide. So from a fire standpoint, there's definitely a concern for residents in hoarding situations, both from the risk of fire, but also from an emergency and escape perspective. Obviously, there's a higher risk of fire in these situations because of the amount of combustibles that are present, meaning there's less clearance from ignition sources like stove, heaters, electrical, etc. There is an increased fuel load, so if a fire does happen, it's going to burn much faster and hotter than a room with less contents. And there's also the risk that smoke alarms aren't going to operate properly because of either the lack of maintenance or the potential that they're blocked with combustibles. And many times there's also blocked exits in these situations, which are potentially going to prevent escape from the home. Outside of the fire concerns, there's also concerns on our end for residents in regards to medical emergencies, as narrow pathways and blocked doors can impact access for emergency responders to that resident. Next slide. So the excessive amounts of combustibles also pose hazardous and dangerous situations for our responders as well. The excess fuel load leads to increased heat and smoke development. Escape and rescue efforts are often impeded because of blocked doors and windows. And there's the risk of possible entrapment of firefighters and structural collapse because of the fire load and water weight. Next slide. So fire services are required to respond to all requests and complaints related to fire safety, regardless of the nature of the complaint. So when we receive a hoarding complaint, whether it comes from family members, landlords, friends, or neighbors, or even other service personnel, it doesn't always mean that an inspection is going to take place, but we are required by law to assess the situation and then determine what our next steps are going to be. Next slide. So under the Fire Protection and Prevention Act, the FPPA, assistants to the fire marshal are permitted to enter land or premises without a warrant to assess fire safety. During this inspection, we can enter at any reasonable time, and we can bring any person to assist us. So that could be bylaw, police, electrical standards authority, anyone that we deem necessary to assist us in the inspection. And during those inspections, we also have the power to issue inspection orders. Next slide. So there are a number of enforcement options available to the fire service to mitigate the risk of fire. I'll put the disclaimer out there though that, even though we have all these tools in the toolbox, a lot of times the situation doesn't always warrant the more extreme steps. And in those extreme steps, there are also multiple layers of approvals that we need to receive in order for us to be able to implement them. Next slide. So an immediate threat to life is probably the most severe and most extreme situation that we would have. In order to have an ITL, the fire inspector needs to determine that there is an absolute risk of fire. So in other words, combining elements of an ignition source in close proximity to combustibles, and a concern that if a fire did occur, human life would be placed at serious risk. So section 15.1 of the FPPA allows an inspector to do a number of things if we determine that an ITL does exist. That includes removing people, removing combustibles and ignition sources, adding temporary safeguards, including smoke alarms, and as you can see on the screen there, a few other things. So even if an inspector does determine that an ITL exists, they don't have to do everything that's listed on the screen. They can do some and not others. For example, they could install smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. They could establish clear access to exits. They can establish clearance from combustibles, and they can provide education, but not remove the resident. Next slide. So section 21 of the FPPA allows the inspector to order the owner or occupant, basically anybody that has control over the premises, to take measures necessary to ensure fire safety. So many of these measures are the same as what we would find under an immediate threat to life, but with the exception of removing people from the premises. And an inspection order would most likely be issued in a circumstance where the conditions make it more appropriate to provide a little bit of time to the owner or the occupant to rectify the fire hazard or fire code violations. And again, in those case studies that some of the other panelists talked about, there was reference to issuing orders to comply. Next slide. So a closure of premises is another option that we have. So in circumstances where they are extreme and the risk to occupants is just too high, the FPPA gives inspectors the power to close premises, which involves actually removing the persons from the premises and preventing any further entry to the premises until corrective actions can be taken. So there's two ways that this can be done. One, the inspector can order the owner or the occupant to do it, which is the order to close. And then the second option is that the fire service or municipality receives authorization from the fire marshal to do it themselves. So in both cases, like I said, there's multiple layers of approval. So review and approval is required in both of these situations by the Fire Marshal of Ontario. But in the order to close, the first option there, the owner and the occupant is responsible. Whereas in the second option, the authorization to close, the municipality or fire service actually closes the property because the owner is either unavailable, incapable of doing, or unwilling to close the property. Next slide. So an electrical order is also something that we have the power to issue. And this is one that I have seen and heard of being used many times, to be honest, not just in hoarding situations. And basically, if a fire inspector identifies that electrical installations are posing a fire risk, so many times that includes breakers or junction boxes that have been altered or not being used or installed properly, excessive extension cords, those types of situations. An inspector can order that the electrical installations be inspected. So when we issue an electrical order, it's actually issued to the Electrical Safety Authority as well as the owner of the premises. And we're basically ordering the ESA to come out and carry out an inspection of the premises. Next slide. So for most fire services, and I'm kind of keeping this very, very broad because all fire services operate a little bit differently in terms of the resources that we have and what we're able to do or what our policies and procedures are. But for most fire services, the number one concern really is to ensure that residents have proper detection. So one of the first things that we do when we enter is to ensure that our residents have working smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. So the FPPA, like I've very quickly gone through, does provide several options to address fire hazards and fire contraventions or contraventions of the fire code. And there are times when the options that we just talked about, the inspection orders, the ESA orders or electrical order, immediate threat to life, orders to close, there are times that we will take those routes, but in many cases, we don't go down those more extreme routes, just given the situation, the sensitivity and the complexity surrounding the hoarding situations. So a lot of times we will use the inspection orders or just try and use education with the residents and tenants in order to try and get some sort of compliance. So the most common things that we will see, again, are inspection orders being issued to order the removal of combustibles, to order clearance from ignition sources. We try and limit the disruption to residents as much as possible because, again, it is a very complex situation. And ultimately, we don't want to remove anyone from their homes unless it's absolutely necessary. So in terms of what we do when we come across these situations, again, as resources differ depending from fire service and region and all across the province. Everybody deals with them a little bit differently. So I know in York Region and Richmond Hill, we do have resources available to us to assist these residents. So since we aren't the experts, we would make a referral. We'll do what we can to address the fire safety concerns, but then we will typically make a referral to other services like public health, mental health, all those other agencies that are able to address the hoarding situation from that angle, as opposed to the fire safety aspect. So there are tools in the toolbox for the fire service. And again, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, it is a great way to try and deal with the situation. But it is also something that we are not the experts on, and we will use those tools in our toolbox to the best of our ability to keep basically everybody safe, the residents in the unit, as well as the surrounding residents and the landlords. That's all I've got, Jerry.
Thank you, Shannon. That was a really thorough overview, and you crammed a lot of information into a short period of time. So thank you for that and the important work that you do to keep our communities safe. I'm going to hand it over to Vittoria Vecchiarelli. But before I do, I just want to note, when we were planning this webinar, the panelists told me that 2 hours was not enough time, and we are demonstrating that. So we will not be able to wrap up exactly at 2 o'clock. I'm hoping those of you who are on the call can stay on an extra few minutes. And for those of you who have to leave, we will be sharing the recording. So you'll be able to access the rest of the panel. So Vittoria Vecchiarelli is a senior public health inspector with more than 16 years experience in the field, and 6 of those years have been in health hazards related to housing complaints. I'll also mention that Vittoria has been a longstanding member of the RentSafe Collaborative, and really glad to have you here with us today. So thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay. So I just wanted to start off with, I guess, just some understanding of the legal powers, or I guess the legal tools that public health has. So the powers of a public health inspector, such as the duty to inspect, are set out by the Health Protection and Promotion Act, or the HPPA. And the duty to inspect and determine the extent of compliance with the HPPA and its regulations is for the purpose of preventing, eliminating, and decreasing the effects of health hazards. So I think one of the items that you may be more familiar with public health is like restaurant inspections or food safety. So there is a specific regulation for restaurant inspections or food safety. It's a food premises regulation, and it provides I guess, specific conditions in which any premise or facility that prepares food are required to comply with. And if there's not, there's opportunity for enforcement action and enclosures as well, with what are the conditions that need to be met for that facility or premise to be reopened. And so, as I mentioned, with the order, you can public health inspectors or public health can issue a Section 13 HPPA order if the PHI or the public health inspector is of the opinion under reasonable and probable grounds that a health hazard exists. So I mentioned, for example, food safety, but when it comes to housing, some examples would include pest infestation, mold or indoor air quality issues, and I should just clarify, it would be significant mold, lack of potable water, or sewage backup and malfunctions. You can advance the slide. So what the HPPA and its regulations do not do is give the public health inspector right of entry into a private dwelling without the consent of the occupier. That would be breaking and entering. So if the tenant allows invites public health in, then we can enter, we can definitely go, but if they do not want us to enter, we cannot enter. But if we do, then we have the right of entry. That's different than when we go to a food premise, for example, and we have always the right of entry. We cannot be denied access. One way to work around this is if we are invited by the landlord, but the landlord is required then during one of their inspections, so we can join them with their scheduled, or I guess scheduled visit that they've determined, or let the tenant know with advance notice and the required amount of time. We can enter that way. Another thing that the HPPA does not do is, oh, sorry, just if you can go back quickly, just is set minimum standards for rental dwellings and housing. So as I mentioned, with food premises, there is that regulation that sets minimum standards and those, but we don't have that for rental dwellings and housing. So we rely specifically on the Act and that Section 13 order, and having the duty or the to I guess prove that a health hazard exists. We can advance to the next slide. And so before we would issue an order, we would look at other things, explore all our options. We want to look at a collaborative approach, education. We want to see that what other interventions can we use in order to get the desired outcome that we're all seeking. Other items that could be considered are like what other tenants or residents are being impacted by the perceived health hazard. So the public health goal in responding to hoarding complaints is to keep the individual with lived experience hoarding housed. And I think many of the other presenters have said the same. Connect the individual to appropriate mental health and social services and programs. So depending on the health unit, whether they're connected, they're a low tier, a higher tier, a lower tier, are connected, depending on the municipality, they may be better equipped or better, I guess, connected to other services, social service programs, and services and mental health assistance. So hopefully that public health unit can connect you if you're the first door that you're knocking on is public health, that as well as trying to provide education and supports and maybe an on-site visit, and using any legal tools that are in our toolbox if appropriate, that we're also referring, whether it's soft referral or to these other social services and programs that are available to the landlord and or the tenant. Specifically because we find that that is really the best approach to get the best outcome. And of course, working collaboratively with stakeholders to achieve the best outcome for all involved. Can advance the next slide. And again, I was saying is that the role of public health is to provide action under existing policies. So we do have policies to how do we respond to indoor air quality mold complaints, pest infestation, sewage backup, and lack of potable water, and the main ones. Often, again, that requires collaboration or cooperation, to say, from both the tenant and the landlord. If you're having a hoarding situation, obviously being able to mitigate any of these issues or health hazards listed also require, I guess, some cleanup and some in that collaboration, sorry, I should say cooperation. So that's why it's so important that we all work collaboratively. And who to issue the order to is also another tricky, it also makes that enforcement tricky. When you have a designated, for example, bring back the food safety or food premise regulation, usually it's directed to a person, but usually more often to an operator, so the owner. But another role, of course, like I said, is education recommendations and support. So for example, infection prevention and control, mold remediation, integrated pest management. So of course, we can definitely provide supports that way. And the best way to clean up mold is just one example. And then referrals to appropriate agencies, as those that I've mentioned. There might be one more slide, Jerry. Okay, so and one thing about providing, I guess, a referral to a social services program or other other supports, at the end of the day, we can provide or suggest or make recommendations, do the referral, but the tenant or the person with lived experience hoarding does have to consent to that intervention. And other agencies are many of our partners that we have in our on the call today, but they also include property standards or bylaw or the OSPCA and our community supports. And that's all from me. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Public health plays a really important role in responding, and I appreciate you providing an overview of the ways that public health can support people who hoard. So we are moving into our Q&A. As I mentioned, we are over time. We're planning to stay on the call for another 10 minutes or so. And so maybe I'll just offer my thanks to all of the panelists for your incredible presentations, the depth of the discussion today, and your work in this field. And I will open it up to a Q&A. So the first question, I think, is directed toward the legal team. And it comes from Giovanni, who raises concerns regarding the responsibility of landlords to engage with tenants' mental health. Giovanni recognizes the importance of clear communication and health and safety, but mentions issues with disincentivizing landlords and detriment to everyone involved. So I wonder if there is a response to that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So I've taken a look at Giovanni's questions that were posted. I mean, certainly landlords are not going to put themselves into a medical practitioner's role. They're not qualified to do that. But there's a difference between noticing that there's an accommodation need and asking for that medical information from a qualified medical practitioner to then figure out how you can accommodate that tenant and help that tenant meet the essential duties of their tenancy, right? So reside in that unit without clutter. So I don't see the creeping risk of assuming responsibility that Giovanni sees. I see very clarified roles. The landlord has their role, medical practitioners have their role, and tenants have theirs. And asking for information and giving yourself the tools and the knowledge that you need to offer that accommodation is the role of the landlord. The second question that was posed is the disincentive that would exist if you're putting the cost of decluttering onto landlords with respect to hoarding issues. I understand there's different viewpoints around human rights accommodation and things of that nature, but there's also a significant disincentive to violating the Human Rights Code. So you can have your views on policy issues, but ultimately you have to abide by the code, or those results can be disastrous. And so you can see it as a disincentive, or you can see it as at different points in people's lives, whether they're in employment or whether they're in housing or whether they're entering and engaging with a service or entering into a contract, we all will have mental health issues that creep up, and we all would want support in those types of social areas, including housing. And so yes, it can create extra work for landlords. If you do it correctly, it can really cement and ferment the relationship between the landlord and tenant as well. And we've heard examples from Sharon and Angela of where there have been really successful situations where you've pulled in people who have that expertise, legal clinics, medical practitioners, and the result has been great, and that landlord and tenant relationship has continued. So along with the profit that you make from being a landlord, you also have obligations, and I think working together and recognizing those is really important for the relationship.
Thank you, Wade. Does anyone have anything to add, or should we move on to the next question? Okay, this is a bit of a practical question. Are there government services and agencies that can assist with the cleanup and disposal? And maybe this can also be wrapped into the question around health and safety in responding.
I can help you out a little bit with that one. So I would suggest looking at government is a little different. Housing authorities have different pots of money called chippy funds in different municipalities, and often called housing options programs, that kind of thing. So you can address your local Ontario Works or housing center, and they can sort of elicit some options that they have in terms of programming for supporting folks that are precariously housed or maybe in imminent risk of some housing challenges, and can offer, every municipality is different in what they have in terms of caps on what they offer in the application. Other than that, it's a little bit of a challenge. The safety protocol, I did address a piece in terms of the clutter. It's called the Clutter Hoarding Scale Quick Reference, and it's through the Institute for Challenging Disorganization, and it really talks about the structure, animal, household functions, health and safety, personal protection, and it goes through levels of accommodation and to ensure that there's a level of understanding of what you're walking into in those environments and how to then protect yourself and the individual. So I have downloaded that, and I can send it to Jerry, and she's more than able to send that out in her packaging later.
Thank you, Sherry. I'll also just do a plug. This will be included in the follow-up materials that we send out, but 2-in-1 Ontario is available across the province and can support referrals. And they do have specific referrals for hoarding in different regions. Sherry, I just wonder if there's an area, you touched on this in our earlier question, that doesn't have hoarding specific responses, but do have mental health services. Are there certain ways that tenants might be able to self-advocate, or their supporters, perhaps their landlords?
It's a little, it's become quite a topic actually in mental health and how we're supporting it. And right now, because of the complex issues and there's no additional funding, the agencies themselves are having to accommodate based on their capacity and knowledge and understanding of hoarding. And so it's becoming increasingly more aware. And so I still advocate people to certainly reach out to their local mental health agencies, and hopefully they would then assist in navigating services that maybe they're aware of in the community and or housing departments. Some of them have taken on some of these initiatives. And certainly there is an opportunity if people want to engage. And again, you can put my email in the forwarding documents that you're sending out, and I can help navigate some training and opportunities just to continue to bring awareness and have tenants the availability of getting the services that they need and support.
Thank you. I think this will be a fairly quick response. Is the threshold to accommodate for a mental health supportive housing provider greater in the landlord tenant board's eyes?
There are never quick answers when it comes to the law. It depends. Again, the duty to accommodate is assessed on a case-by-case basis. So it depends on the individual circumstances of the tenant. It depends on the resources of the landlord. Certainly in the context of the supporting housing provider, where housing, hard to house, particularly vulnerable tenants, is part of the landlord's mandate, then I think that would certainly be relevant for the board's consideration.
Thanks, Sharon. Okay, we're going to try and wrap up, not too delayed. So I'll offer the last question, which is to each of our panelists: what key message would you like landlords and housing providers to leave with today? And you can just popcorn your own response.
I think there's a shared interest in working collaboratively from a legal perspective.
I would ditto that response as Sharon. I think collaborative work, and just if you don't know, just call and ask is almost a better response for us in terms of mental health. Even if agencies don't have the response that you're looking for, they certainly can assist in navigating. So I would rather collaborative than none.
And I would say the faster you engage other supports, the better. In the case study I described, they might not have gotten to the point there were teddy bears in the oven if they would have engaged other supports when they noticed the garbage problem in the smell. So the sooner you act to engage help, the better.
My comment would be that the law is really a last resort. something that hopefully you never need to get to, and you can do that by acting reasonably and compassionately and cooperatively. And then all of these things that scare, both landlords and tenants never come to be because you don't have to rely upon them.
I couldn't say it better than Wade. I think I completely agree with him. I think if you approach it with empathy and compassion, react as quickly as you can, and whatever door you knock on, just see what they can do or what other, through their own networks, if there's other suggestions or referrals they can provide you. If they can give you a hand referral, as I mean like a name or somebody that, or phone number, more specifically, that would be helpful too. Just keep insisting for looking for help, but with that approach, I think you will find some supports.
Thank you. And Hannah asked me to share that hoarding is a highly complex issue, and that although as a landlord you're likely to face difficulties, this is not because the tenant is trying to be difficult. Compassion will get you much further along than combativeness. So thank you all for those messages and the reminder of the importance of collaboration, compassion, and kindness. So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to turn it over to Erica Phipps, who is the Director of RentSafe and the Executive Director of the Canadian Partnership for Children's Health and Environment. And Erica will then pass it over to Trish Thompson from the Landlord Self-Help Center. So thank you, everyone, from me.
So, wow, as founding director of RentSafe, I'm so thrilled and gratified to see the way this event has come together, as it really exemplifies the kinds of constructive and practical problem solving we aim to catalyze and support through the dynamic and intersectoral space we call RentSafe. So I'd like to thank my colleague Jerry for her tireless efforts in coordinating this event, and Trish Thomas and the Landlord Self-Help Center for this wonderful collaboration, and all of our panelists, many of whom are active in RentSafe, for generously sharing their experience and expertise. Most especially, I'd like to thank the hundreds of landlords and others who are with us today for their interest in learning more about supporting tenants with hoarding difficulties. So we look forward to continuing our efforts through RentSafe to bring people together to optimize and support the roles of multiple sectors, including those of you who are providing housing, and ensuring our shared goal of safe, healthy homes for all. So thank you very much. And I pass it over to you, Trish, now for our closing.
Oh, thank you everyone for attending today. What a fantastic panel of presenters, and a thorough and practical and compassionate overview of hoarding. It's just phenomenal. I'd like to thank my co-organizer, Jerry Blinick at RentSafe, and for that collaboration and being part of this. It's been fantastic. And to Dave Glett at Ocean One Design for his incredible patience and support while planning this event. Just a quick note to let you know that there's going to be a follow-up survey asking for your feedback on this presentation, and also we'll provide you with an opportunity to make suggestions on topics of interest for our future Lunch and Learn series. So stay tuned for that. This concludes the presentation. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone.